Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The moderator in last night's vice presidential debate casually and smugly threw out some pretty spectacular climate misinformation.
America growing, the V-shaped recovery that's underway right now will continue with 4 more years of President Donald Trump.
Thank you very much, Vice President Pence. Once again, you've provided the perfect segue to a new topic, which is climate change. And Vice President Pence, I'd like to pose the first question to you. This year, we've seen record-setting hurricanes in the South. Another one, Hurricane Delta, is now threatening the Gulf. And we have seen record-setting wildfires in the West. Do you believe, as the scientific community has concluded, that man-made climate change has made wildfires bigger, hotter, and more deadly, and have made hurricanes wetter, slower, and more damaging?
The amount of misinformation which she threw out there was pretty spectacular, as I'm about to show you. This is the graph of the 20-year mean of the number of landfalling U.S. hurricanes. You can see that they've been declining since the 1880s. The most active hurricane season in U.S. history occurred in 1886 when Grover Cleveland was president. Texas was hit by 4 hurricanes and Florida was hit by 3. 2 locations in the U.S. were hit by more than 1 hurricane. One of these 7 hurricanes was a Category 4, which wiped the city of Indianola, Texas off the map permanently. It's very unlikely that the 2020 season will come close to 1886. Another very bad hurricane season was 1893, when the United States was hit by 3 major hurricanes. The 5th deadliest hurricane in U.S. history occurred in 1893 with 2,000 deaths, as did the 7th deadliest hurricane with 1,000 to 2,000 deaths. The deadliest U.S. hurricane occurred in the year 1900 in Galveston, Texas, with at least 10,000 deaths, and the second deadliest occurred in 1899 with 3,400 deaths. 8 of the 10 deadliest hurricanes in U.S. history occurred more than 90 years ago. Savannah, Georgia was largely wiped out by one of the 3 major hurricanes which hit the U.S. in 1893. Now let's look at the deadliest Atlantic tropical cyclones. The deadliest one occurred this week in 1780, with more than 22,000 people dead. Many of the deadliest Atlantic hurricanes occurred right around the time of the Revolutionary War. 1780, 1776, 1775, 1782, 1791, 1781, 1780, 1767, and 1780. Almost all of the deadliest Atlantic hurricanes occurred when carbon dioxide levels were below 350 parts per million, and many occurred when CO2 levels were below 300 parts per million. There is 0 historical evidence to support the moderator's claim that hurricanes have become more destructive. The 1780 Great Atlantic Hurricane, which was the deadliest on record, wiped out every single structure in Barbados. According to the National Hurricane Center, it had winds over 200 miles per hour and stripped all the bark off the trees. It lifted the heavy cannons at a fort 100 feet into the air. The moderator's claims about hurricanes were absurd, and they were the exact opposite of science. Now let's look at her claims about fires. On this date in 1871, the deadliest fires in U.S. history occurred. Chicago burned to the ground on October 8, 1871, and that wasn't the deadliest fire which occurred in the United States that day. But before I talk about October 8, 1871, let me talk a little bit about the fires which were occurring earlier that week. The New York Times reported on October 3, 1871, that the prairies were in flames. 150 miles swept by fire, men, women, and children fleeing for their lives, immense loss of property of all kinds. Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin were burning, and on October 6, the New York Times reported that the Great Prairie Fire is still raging with unabated fury. On October 7, 1871, the Chicago Tribune reported on conflagrations and the continuance of destructive fires in Wisconsin and Minnesota. They used the same language as the New York Times. In the Minnesota forest, the Great Fire is still raging with unabated fury. But a day later, the Chicago Tribune had a different story to report. Chicago burned to the ground. Folklore is that the Chicago fire was started by a cow, but the fact that there were massive fires all around the Great Lakes that day makes that story seem pretty unlikely. The deadliest fire that day occurred around Green Bay, Wisconsin, where more than 1,000 people died at Peshtigo. The stories out of Peshtigo were horrific. People boiled to death in the bottoms of wells. Melted coins were found in people's pockets. People were just leaving church and the firestorm came out of nowhere. All of a sudden there was a tremendous roar like a hurricane and the city was engulfed by fire. I'm not going to read to you any of the horror stories which came out of Peshtigo, Wisconsin that day, but there were many of them in the press at the time. By October 12th, they had found 325 dead bodies in Peshtigo, and many more were found later. And the Rocky Mountains were also being ravaged by fire at that time. The fires in the Rocky Mountains began on August 25th and continued unabated. Besides the fires in Wisconsin, Illinois, and the Rocky Mountains, Michigan and Canada was also being ravaged by fire on that day. The fire which hit Peshtigo was described as a 12-mile wide hurricane. A huge area of the United States was burning on this date in 1871, which makes the claims from the USA Today Moderator last night all the more absurd. But there's nothing new about the ignorance, superstition, and misinformation from the USA Today Moderator. In fact, the press was doing exactly the same thing when the fires were occurring in 1871. Here's a great article from the Brisbane Courier, January 10, 1871. Imaginary Changes of Climate. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. Every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. The USA Today Moderator last night was parroting the same mindless climate superstition which has been going on for hundreds of years. And these people always believe that science supports their ignorant position. She casually makes claims about the scientific community which have no basis in reality.
Do you believe, as the scientific community has concluded,
Toto understands that there's always a few worthless scientists out there like Michael Mann and Katherine Hayhoe who will say anything for attention and money. Those are the only people who the press will talk to. They would never talk to a scientist like me who would actually tell them the truth. It's unfortunate that the American people are bombarded day after day by the press and by schools with all this misinformation. Toto is doing his best to straighten it out. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.